Well, I had one guy ask me to do the Damsel deep dive and 0 people asking me to skip it, so here we go. Damsel, in a lot of ways, is arguably the most disturbing film I've seen in recent years. If you were hoping this video was just going to be me breaking down all the reasons why this movie is bad, I'm afraid I don't have time for that. I've only got so much time per week to work on videos, and I'm not going to repeat the criticisms made by The Critical Drinker or Lauren Chen. If you haven't already, go watch one of their videos before watching this one. If you're still here, I'm going to assume you're caught up, not just on the plot, but on how the film was lackluster at best. I give the film a solid 4 out of 10. Not good enough to be enjoyable, and not awful enough to be so bad it's good. It's boring, which is the worst thing a film can be. But the reason I'm making this analysis is because there's actually a lot more depth here than most people realize. Now, people might look at this film and see just a boring, by-the-numbers film and will accuse me of reading too much into it. That's because those people aren't writers. When you're a writer, you start to know how stuff like this is made. When the project you're working on is something that you put your heart and soul into, like a genuine work of art, you're going to consciously inject as much depth as you can until you have something that looks like the Dark Souls franchise. But that's not how Damsel was made. Damsel is a paint-by-numbers, cobbled together from subversions of cliches that have been done to the point of becoming cliches themselves. This was done by people who just wanted to collect a paycheck. And when that's the kind of slop you're working on, where depth wasn't supposed to be there in the first place, your subconscious brain starts filling the holes in on its own. The people who made this film, whether they realized it or not, captured something particularly disturbing about how society is currently unfolding, and how things are probably going to go in the near future. Let's ignore the prologue for a moment and start the analysis by looking at Elodie, the main heroine. Our first view of Elodie has her cutting wood in what used to be a forest that's been picked bare. We are told that this is centuries after the old king failed to kill the dragon, meaning things have been going on for a while. Elodie and her sister discuss how their people are freezing and starving. So the environment has been literally stripped bare of resources, and people are unable to stay warm in winter. Not to get too swept up into the environmentalist angle, but in real life, cutting down all the trees would wreck the climate and make the region colder. This is literally what turned Greenland into the snowy landscape it became famous for. It would also drive out most of the wildlife for hunting and trapping, depleting vital sources of food. A lot of people today still believe that Greenland and Iceland got their names because people in Iceland wanted everyone to go to Greenland and leave them alone. In reality, Greenland used to be green before the Vikings cut down all the trees, and Iceland is just derived from the word for island. So, the current methods these people have for fending off the harsh realities of nature are just making their problems worse in the long run, and at this point, all of the easy-to-access materials they can use to stay warm have been used up. I want you to keep this in mind. In any other film made by Hollywood writers, Elodie would be recast as an incompetent white guy and would be the main villain in an eco-friendly film. The fact that the movie ignores this will be important later. In the real world, people are feeling the hurt of collapsing economies around the globe. The word economics literally means the art of living. When the economy tanks, people starve. Now, normally, they starve in third world nations out of sight and out of mind for people who live in the West. But in recent years, people in the first world are starting to finally see the rising prices in grocery stores with empty shelves. And we keep coming back to the firewood. People in England and Germany are having trouble heating their homes right now due to their rising costs of energy. Some of this is due to people with bafflingly stupid ideas about how to protect the environment, usually by turning to energy sources that are more destructive than coal or nuclear power. But some of this is also due to the rising cost of coal in a world where fewer young men want to become miners. There's just not as many men going into the jobs that keep the lights on. There's also fewer men involved in manufacturing jobs, things we originally thought we'd be able to replace with robots. And of course, there are fewer men going into the power production jobs, so fewer men working in the power plants. Now, a point many people have noted in this society is that there are very few male characters in Damsel that actually matter. There's Elodie's dad, there's Prince Henry, and then there's the original reigning king. The current king is just sort of there, and he doesn't even have any speaking lines. This movie depicts a world in which there are almost no men, and the ones that do exist are either too old to work or involved in government bureaucracies. Kind of like what we're seeing with men today. The most popular job Zoomer men want to go into is to be a YouTuber. Other popular jobs for men include lawyers, investment bankers, and occasionally software engineers. But there's not a lot of guys who want to be factory workers, welders, farmers, or the guys who make things work. I'm not judging, by the way. I'm guilty of this too. I spend all day reading documents in an office for a living. The reason that men aren't going to do these jobs anymore is really simple. They don't have wives or families to take care of. It's a recurring meme at this point that men don't need anywhere near as many resources to be happy as they do to provide for a family. Some people estimate that men only need about a tenth of the money that they would need to provide for a family. And as more and more men are starting to give up on finding a wife and building a family, they aren't even bothering looking for the kinds of jobs that pay that kind of money. And a lot of these necessary, dirty jobs are so unpleasant that the only way you can get anyone to do them is by offering them higher wages. And while society has spent the last decade or so telling young women they aren't entitled to a wife or girlfriend, they're not going to be saying that for much longer. Because every guy can respond with, "You're not entitled to food or electricity either." And here we cut to the heart of the matter, and what Damsel is really all about. This film is based in part on the fairy tale of the Lindworm Prince. In that story, the dragon isn't just a monster to be defeated, but is actually the firstborn son of the king and queen, due to some magical mishap where the queen ate the wrong rose, or didn't peel the onions right, or whatever. Short version of the story, the younger human prince can't get married until the Lindworm gets a bride, and he basically holds the kingdom for ransom until he gets what he wants. This is essentially a story about an ugly guy in a position of power where he can force society to offer him a bride. Keep this in mind because the dragon represents two things. One of them being ugly men who women really don't want to marry, men who happen to have things that society needs in order to fend off Mother Nature, which is the other thing the dragon represents. Now, in Greek mythology, the god Hephaestus was the original ugly bastard. He was born with a malformed face, his mother Hera threw him off of Mount Olympus and permanently crippled him. But then he developed skills as a craftsman and became famous even today as the ultimate blacksmith. And then the Olympians found themselves in a pickle. They needed Hephaestus's craftsmanship, but they had already treated him so badly that there was no way he would come back to Olympus and work for them unless he got something he wanted in return. Specifically, a wife. Hopefully one who loved him back. But there was a major problem. In some versions, the blacksmith has a nice enough personality and can easily provide for a wife and family, but the only women on Olympus who might have looked past his ugly appearance to notice any of that would have been Athena, Hestia, and in some versions, Artemis. If you're familiar with Greek mythology, then you probably know that those three are also the virgin goddesses, who have sworn never to marry anyone. So, the only women who might have willingly overlooked Hephaestus' appearance have all joined the nunnery, essentially. In some myths, if Hephaestus doesn't get his bride, he threatens to leave and help the Titans, or some other enemies of Olympus who will give him what he wants. And you can't just throw the ugliest, most unpleasant woman you can find at him, as if that will satisfy the craftsman. There's an economist named Aaron Clarey, who once said that if men are the engine that the economy runs on, then female youth and beauty is the fuel. And that fuel has to be a certain grade or it doesn't work. Like most self-respecting men, Hephaestus wants a virgin who will love him willingly. Otherwise, he'll leave and work for someone else. And what this represents is the fact that it isn't just Hephaestus you have to satisfy. It's future generations of men who aren't going to do the kinds of dirty, labor-intensive work that society runs on unless they also get a wife out of the deal. So, who's left? Who is left in all of Olympus that Zeus could set his ugly son up with? Preferably someone that Zeus hasn't already gotten pregnant. Well, there's Aphrodite. Depending on who you ask, she's not an Olympian, since she's technically in the same generation as the Titans, although she was born much later than the others. Technically speaking, Aphrodite has no right to live on Mount Olympus because she's part of the same class of deities that the gods just overthrew. But she wants to live in the heavenly realm, so Zeus tries to settle this by arranging for her to be Hephaestus' wife. Effectively, she married her immigration papers. Of course, Aphrodite is basically the Greek equivalent of a hot mess. She cheats on her new husband with every chance she gets with Ares. And this, in a lot of ways, is a warning to young men who try to simply earn a wife through their careers or their personalities. It never truly makes up for being ugly. We'll be getting back to this in a bit. Now in Damsel, the dragon literally bleeds gold. There's a treasure hoard around the slain dragon babies. So we have a character that simultaneously represents a force of nature and a person who has to be appeased in order to get the treasure. Although it's not in the direct sense in this movie. The Araians, the kingdom that's been sacrificing women to the dragon, have gold in abundance. For the Brayfords, their best chance at survival during the winter is to basically sell their daughter to the Araians. Now, by all means, the Araians should be poor. A common thread you're going to see in this film is that people are either poor or rich for no apparent reason. The dragon is definitely not sharing its wealth with the Araians, and if they're buying off poor families to get their daughters to sacrifice 3 of them per generation, you'd think they'd be bankrupt. And for a long period of human history, this was a big part of altar diplomacy. A lot of effort was put into ensuring women, especially noble women, were as attractive as possible to fetch a higher bride price. A lot of women were effectively sold to men in exchange for the resources needed to keep society alive. And the fear a lot of people have, whether they know it consciously or it just gnaws on them in the back of their minds, is that we're all going to have to go back to that as the economy falls apart. And for all the propaganda we have trying to pretend otherwise, that's going to be a problem for a lot of women, some of which are going to have bigger problems with this than others.
How are you today? I see. Yes, I'm inside my fortified totalitarian city-state. Things have never been better here at Castle Lemongrab. I've never been fatter.
Now, the film literally opens with a woman noting the many tales of chivalrous knights rescuing damsels. Then the old king gets all of his knights killed in the stupidest way imaginable during the prologue, literally by standing in the open and letting them get barbecued without even taking cover by the stone columns nearby. Does the king equip his knights with shields? Nope. Does he think to arm some of them with crossbows or some other ranged weaponry to fight a creature who can fly? Not a chance. This is symbolic for the fact that we used to have heroic men who would step up to protect and provide, not just for women, but for society as a whole. And for the most part, people really want men to keep doing this and expect no reward. In fact, some people think that this should be our solution to the current economic collapse. Just nag men into stepping up and continuing to run our economy while expecting nothing in return. And there were some men who were willing to do that. There are still a few men left who are like that now. But not enough to maintain the economic machine that keeps us all alive. And the thing is, people like that tend to come in two flavors. First, there's chumps who expect that one day their generosity will be reciprocated. Yeah, you can only be so naive and still be competent enough to actually get things done. And the other kind are guys who are just good for the sake of being good. But those guys will eventually ask themselves whether they are, in fact, doing the right thing by enabling a bunch of entitled people who are just leeching off of other heroic individuals. Everyone thinks that they want to have people around who are just good for the hell of it in their lives. What they don't realize is that people who are like that can't stand being around evil people. Even Jesus in the Bible couldn't stand being around hypocrites and wouldn't help them. Men like that will inevitably stop helping those people because that is the right thing to do. So what we see in the world of Damsel is that there are no heroic men around. The only batch of men who would step up to challenge the dragon were killed off in the prologue, and we can interpret this as the government, that'd be the first Arrayne king, getting all the masculine men wiped out by his poor decisions and leadership skills. One could think of this as a legal system with government policies that have driven men away from areas where we would need them to fill. What's notable here is that there's no point in the film that anyone tells men to step up and slay the dragon. That's never even presented as an option in the film. The closest we get is Elodie's father, who tries to save his daughter from the dragon and gets crushed to death for it. It's important because none of these men are even called cowards for not trying to fight the dragon. It's like the people who worked on this film have given up on nagging men to step up. No, instead the solution this film provides for dealing with the original threat of the movie, that is, the cold reality of things like winter and Mother Nature, is to kill the people who have wealth and presumably loot their kingdom. At the end of the movie, Elodie and the all-female survivors mention how they suddenly have plenty of supplies. Yeah, where did those come from? Well, they seem to have come from killing off the entire Arrayne bloodline. Now, a lot of people complain about the morality of Damsel, where the dragon gets to live, even though she unambiguously slaughtered more innocent people than anyone else in the movie. Even though the dragon thought it was killing daughters of the royal family, it was still trying to kill innocent girls and exacting a revenge that was well above and beyond the number of children she lost in the film's prologue. Meanwhile, people have pointed out that the Arraynes that are alive by the film's present didn't cause any of this. They just inherited a bad situation where a bloodthirsty dragon demands 3 daughters each generation because of the actions of their long-dead ancestor. The prince even shows that while he's willing to go along with sacrificing women to keep his kingdom safe, he can't go along with killing Elodie's little sister, who is only a child. And at the end, the dragon gets to live, and the Arraynes get barbecued. But what people don't realize is that the dragon doesn't get spared because the dragon is innocent. The dragon gets spared because the point of the film is to propose a solution to the problems many feminists are facing in today's ever-uncertain situation. You see, a lot of people are starting to whisper that feminism is dying. It isn't just the current PR situation with companies like Sweet Baby Inc. and Kotaku. The fact of the matter is that most women in the first world work almost exclusively in jobs that are, at best, the dessert of the economy, such as writers, professors for elective courses, YouTubers, VTubers, and the like. These are things that might be nice to have, but they're also the first things to get cut when times get tough. There's also a whole lot of women working in jobs that are kind of like poison, such as HR departments, but they're effectively in the same boat. As rent prices skyrocket, inflation runs out of control, and stores start closing due to looting, people are going to have to make tough choices about what they can do without. So we start to see mass layoffs, people tightening their belts. And even if you keep your job, you're going to have to accept a lower wage if you're going to stay competitive with the score of other women wanting to get into those same lines of work. Throw in the fact that most corporate jobs are terrible and that many of them are refusing to pay enough money to cover the cost of living within a reasonable commuting distance and also refusing to allow working from home, and you get a swarm of women trying to find any kind of solution. The bottom line is that feminism only really seems to work when the economy is going well. In fact, historically, different societies have had their own versions of feminism that came and went when empires collapsed. A trend that shows up in the late Roman Empire, the late Byzantine Empire, the late Athenian Empire, a lot of empires right before they collapsed. Let's hope that's a coincidence. They all had a form of feminism that was really popular among the upper classes, would sometimes trickle down to the middle class, and never took off among the poor. Feminism doesn't seem to work below a certain standard of living. And I hear a lot of people trying to tell men on the internet not to let the pendulum swing back the other way, to try and stop it in the middle. The problem is, from a feminist perspective, a lot of the things women call rights are going to collapse regardless of what men do. Economic collapse all but guarantees it. The first batch of rights that women are guaranteed to lose are not really rights, but rather entitlements. Things like government support for single moms. The things that a lot of women expect to be there if they get pregnant out of wedlock. When the world governments can no longer borrow money to keep these programs afloat, they'll be the first things to sink. Other things in this category that will fall apart are jobs that don't actually do anything productive, which is what a lot of government jobs ultimately are. And on that note, the second set of rights women will lose will be the employment opportunities for cushy careers. I mentioned in another video a while back that law schools are crammed with lots of women who have no desire to be productive members of society. What they're really there for is to find an easy job that pays well where they don't have to do any actual work. These are the kinds of jobs that are getting replaced by AI, or disappearing altogether because the money just isn't there anymore. And the final set of rights women will lose that ties in with that are the rights that women will still have on paper, but most of them will have no means of acting on them. Women will still have the legal right to get a job and be employed and independent, but the kinds of jobs women can do and would want to do just aren't going to be there. There are a lot of rights that people have today that rely on having money, such as the right to move to a state of your choice with laws that support the things you want. There's the right to avoid bad neighborhoods with high crime. On paper, no one will be forcing anyone to stay in a state they don't like or a hood full of thugs, but if you can't afford to move because you can't get a job, it doesn't matter. And you can argue that all the things I've mentioned aren't actually rights, but it doesn't matter. Feminists feel entitled to them, and they're smart enough to know that they're going to lose them if the economy keeps going the way that it's been going. Feminism has become like a person who has fallen off of a boat and is now thrashing about trying not to drown, and this movie is one of its death throes. This film isn't about finding a moral solution to the problems women face when dealing with nature. It's about finding a solution that satisfies the emotions of the people who made it. In Damsel, killing the Aranes and stealing everything that they own solves Elodie's problems regarding surviving the winter. Killing the dragon doesn't. Oh sure, there's always the question about what Elodie and her village are going to do next year. Seeing as their native landscape has been destroyed by their own deforestation, they can't just loot the Aranes again because they're all presumably dead and have nothing left to steal, and they've probably built up an unsavory reputation with other kingdoms that might consider paying a bride price for Elodie's hand in marriage. But all of that is what people in Hollywood like to call next year's problem. I can't stress this enough. The reason why the morality in this film is so messed up is because the people who made it feel like they're about to lose everything. And the proposed solution of killing everyone and taking their stuff is absolutely something that these people would do. To them, the thought of having to choose between marrying a man they aren't attracted to and having to starve next winter is the same as forcing them into a relationship loaded with SA. And that actually brings me to one of the most important parts of the film, the fact that Elodie ends her confrontation with the dragon half naked. Yeah, I'm sure that someone working on this film put Millie Bobby Brown into this outfit for their own benefit. Gooners are gonna goon. Ask not for whom the goon goons. He goons for thee. But it also reflects a reality that a lot of women really don't want to face, which is the fact that for most women in the near future, survival is going to depend on sex appeal. We're starting to see this unfold in the modern economy already. Forget about the number of Kotaku journalists who have flat out admitted that they plan to go do OnlyFans after losing their jobs. The situation with Zoomer women has become a disaster, where more and more of them have started looking for any way of escaping the current nightmare of the corporate world. It's not just that they're too lazy to get a job. It's that the jobs in the modern world, most of them anyway, aren't paying enough to cover rising housing costs, along with inflation issues. And they can't just hope and pray for a husband to take care of them, because we're living today in what's been called HR world, where any guy who so much as introduces himself to a woman is at risk of losing his job, or getting kicked out of his private community. Just as a side note, I know I previously said that Gen Z women aren't responsible for unleashing the friend zone onto society and destroying the relative comfort that men and women used to have with one another, but Gen Z does not get a pass for HR world. I said in my video a couple of weeks ago that I understand why women do this. They're treating men like they would a wild and dangerous animal, but they're still treating people like animals. If you're a Gen Z woman listening to this right now, you know better. But in response to the fact that the economy is falling apart, more so in other countries, but even America is starting to feel it, a lot of women have just started turning to the corn industry, flooding the internet with a new wave of cheap pornography. And they aren't staying on the adult websites either. They're creeping into places like Twitch, or, as Shuan had put it,
it has been invaded by women. But not only women, naked women.
The worst kind.
Seriously, just go to the homepage on Twitch and it's flooded with this stuff. Twitch is a website marketed to teenagers. These women are literally trying to get 14-year-old boys hooked on their stuff before they're even old enough to go to an actual adult website. And why are they doing this on Twitch? Why not keep it exclusively on the adult websites? Well, everyone seems to be coming to the same conclusion. It's because the market is so saturated that none of these women would be able to stand out. That's how desperate young women are becoming at getting into this industry. Forget the morality of doing OnlyFans for a moment. I don't think the people in Hollywood have any morals to begin with, and even if they did, this is turning into a matter of survival. Most people think of morals as a luxury for after their rent is paid that month. A lot of the women who've lost their jobs at Kotaku have publicly admitted that they're somehow too proud to find a husband, so they're just going to do OnlyFans instead. Man, I still remember when the Hunger Games came out and every girl my age was like, yeah, that's me. If the government became totalitarian and the power went out, I'd grab a bow and be a badass girl boss. And then when things started getting slightly difficult for people, they all started doing OnlyFans. Ladies, I'm not mad. I'm just really disappointed. And let's not fool ourselves into thinking that just any woman has a shot at making a living off of OnlyFans. You have to be attractive. Forget about the stats that show only 1% of women on these kinds of websites end up rich. Your ability to survive on websites like this will be tied to your sex appeal, which is a huge problem for over a third, maybe even more, of American women today. But consider the kinds of women who made this film for a moment. Do you think they like their dating prospects? I'm not saying they're all fat, but how many of them are still good looking enough to set up a cam girl gig if their careers in Hollywood fall apart? Seriously, imagine if you were a woman who was 300 pounds overweight, and you realized that if you didn't find a husband in the next 2 years, you would probably never have electricity or running water again. Things aren't that bad, yet. But that's the thought process going through the minds of a lot of feminists right now, and especially the people who worked on this film. You know, all of this hysteria over the idea of having to either get a real job, or get married to someone you're not attracted to, or having to face starvation if you can't do either, has gotten me thinking about the problems of artists who have no idea how the real world works. I think that's going to have to be the topic of my next video. Also, the game you're seeing me play in the background is called Delta V Rings of Saturn. It's kind of like if someone made an asteroid mining game, injected the difficulty level of Dark Souls, with none of the feeling of accomplishment of a Souls-like, and a very limited tutorial. I picked it because it felt appropriate in a video about how the world's economy is collapsing without men doing dirty jobs. The demo is available on Steam, try it if you want it. I didn't enjoy it, but apparently some people do. That's how you know these games are in the background aren't sponsored. Alright, that's it for this video. Thank you, and goodbye.